Good afternoon, everyone, and Marnie, thank you again for having me. As Marnie said, my name is Mike Tonkovich. I'm the Deer Program Administrator for the Division of Wildlife, and I have had the pleasure of doing that for the last 26 years. I gave this talk, or a version of this talk, actually March 3rd of 2020, so just before we were sent home. Because of the pandemic, there seemed to be some interest, and so Marnie asked me to join you guys today to share this presentation. But in the interest of the group and the time constraints, I've actually made a few minor modifications, which I hope will improve the presentation. The original presentation included a great deal of information about deer herd condition, which I think, of course, most of you will have very little interest in, unless, of course, you're personally are a hunter. The bulk of the presentation this morning is going to be focused on deer disease and really, again, things that are, I think, a little more practical for most of you, and those would be some of the more common anomalies, oddities, and oddball situations, for lack of a better term, that we find ourselves in with regard to deer. We get lots of calls. We have seen lots of strange things over the years, especially now with so many folks having trail cameras, even folks that aren't hunters that just like to have trail cameras in their backyards over bird feeders and whatnot. So we have seen a slew of things, and we get a lot of calls. And I think oftentimes you may find yourself, wondering, hey, does this warrant a call to the Division of Wildlife? Is this something that they need to know about? And so I'm hoping that I can share with you some of the more common things that we see, and maybe give you some guidance on when it is appropriate to call the Division of Wildlife. So my plan for the next 30 minutes or so is to begin this presentation with a brief update on several of the most common diseases that we're dealing with, some more regularly than others here in the state of Ohio, and then spend the rest of the presentation, the rest of the afternoon, talking about, as I mentioned, some of the common ailments, oddities, conditions of white-tailed deer that we see in Ohio. Again, I think because of your positions and your interactions with the public, I think you're going to find this portion of the presentation that much more helpful than the section on disease. But I still think that it's worth covering. Certainly CWD. We'll talk a little bit about bovine tuberculosis, hemorrhagic disease, and a few others that, if for no other reason, give you some background on what we are currently doing here in the Division of Wildlife with regard to those diseases. So as I mentioned, I'm borrowing from a presentation that I gave at a conference in early March of 2020. At that time, this was the distribution of CWD across the United States. As you can see, Oklahoma and Ohio are somewhat unique, and I don't know whether that's because both states began with an O, or begin with an O, I should say. But at any rate, at the time this slide was put together, those were the only two states where CWD had been documented, but limited to the captive side of things. Unfortunately, that changed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. But this is the current distribution of CWD across the United States and into Canada. As you can see, Ohio is now home. You may have to squint there on your screen to see that, but Ohio is home to CWD in the wild. That little gray dot there in Northwest Ohio indicates our most recent detection. Really, nothing else major has changed on this map since the March map that you just looked at. I think the one additional state was Idaho. We added Idaho to the list of states with CWD in the wild herd. And I did just find out here just a few weeks ago, good friends from Tennessee announced that they found a CWD positive wild white-tailed deer just 8 miles from the Kentucky border. This was an adult clinical, I might add, adult white-tailed deer doe. So I think the folks in Kentucky know that it's just a matter of time before they start doing CWD monitoring and surveillance and sharpshooting and the like that goes along, of course, with CWD in your wild deer herd. But they instituted their response plan because the positive there in Tennessee was so close to their border. So current distribution of CWD in the United States, including the positive deer that was detected in Wyandotte County last fall. So our first positive was a wild deer in Wyandotte County. Late 2020 was when we confirmed that. The deer was harvested by a hunter. Deer looked perfectly healthy, as you'll see here in just a second. But for those of you who may be maybe a bit geographically challenged, like myself at times, just to give you some sense for where Wyandotte County lies in the state, it's just a bit north and west of Columbus. And as I mentioned, it was a hunter-harvested buck. It absolutely was a great-looking deer, showed no signs of illness. It was sampled as part of routine surveillance. There in the county. It was taken to a local taxidermist who pulled a sample for us, and it's kind of a fun story. I guess fun now. I can talk about it because it's not as painful as it was then. But clearly, the folks at Colorado State who sent us the lab results had no idea that that was our first positive wild deer. Their email came on December 7th. I'll never forget the date. There was no fanfare, no calls ahead alerting me, to the news. They simply said, "Hey, it looks like you've got a presumptive positive." And of course, that was our first positive. So it was quite the shock. So we were in a very good position, I might add, in order to do additional surveillance in the area. We had several controlled hunts that were still planned in December and January, so we were able to take advantage of those. We had a bonus gun season that had not yet occurred, and of course we had we were just on the tail end of our gun season, so that was not an option. But we had plenty of opportunities to collect additional samples, and that we did. We did collect a second positive. This happened to be a yearling doe. It was harvested, I believe, the last hunt that was planned for the 2020 season on the Killdeer Plains refuge. Following the season, very, very early March, we set out to collect a few additional samples. We had no idea what we were going to be able to do. This was our first time doing targeted removals, and I might say that we were quite successful. I was very happy with how things went. Ended up getting our hands on an additional 72 deer off the refuge and adjacent properties. In all of those, we failed to detect any additional positives. As a result of the positive there in Wyandotte County, the two positives, I should say, in Wyandotte County, we set up a disease surveillance area, which is essentially just an area where we would enact, as you'll see here in just a second, several regulations and collect CWD samples for the next 3 years. So this is our disease surveillance area. It's 22 townships, I believe, across 3 counties, all of Wyandotte County, 3 townships there in Hardin County, and 6 townships in Marion County. I think the total land area covered there is about 625 square miles. Within that disease surveillance area, there are going to be several things: no baiting, no feeding, and most importantly, and this is causing a little bit of heartburn, of course, a little bit of hiccups with our hunting public, and that is deer cannot be taken out of the disease surveillance area unless they're taken to a certified taxidermist or processor. So it's going to take a little getting used to, and I think folks will certainly have that time because these regulations will remain in place for at least 3 years, and I expect probably indefinitely. So because of the situation there in Wyandotte County, I want to make sure everyone is clear. We're certainly not abandoning the rest of the state with regard to CWD surveillance. In fact, because of the positive there in Wyandotte County, we've actually shifted our focus in terms of surveillance this year. We will be conducting routine surveillance in the rest of the state, less 24 counties. There's actually 24 counties that we will not be collecting data in that we have historically collected CWD samples from, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. But we are going to shift focus, as I mentioned, and that focus is going to go from what has historically been targeting those areas of highest risk for disease introduction and spread. Those are the areas that we've collected the most samples from. Those typically are the areas of the state where we have the highest deer densities. But we're going to move away from those areas this year and instead focus on roughly 20, I guess 28 counties. Most of those are going to be in western Ohio, the western half of the state. As you can see, the gray, dark gray counties with the white cross hatching represent what we're calling our 28 targeted counties or high interest counties. Those counties we have historically collected very few samples. Many of those counties we did not begin doing surveillance in until 2019, as a matter of fact. But most of them we have attempted to collect samples from, and have had very little luck. Part of it is the fact that we're talking about many low deer density counties to begin with, but the other is there's simply very few places to collect samples from. So we're going to target those counties this year. And I won't get into the details, but we're hoping through a variety of mechanisms to make our hunters aware that we're looking for additional samples. One of the things is to alert them when they check their deer that they've killed a deer in a county where we have great interest in additional CWD samples, and ask them to help us out, giving them multiple options to do that. In fact, they could drop those off at taxidermists that have agreed to collect samples for us. We've got a number of locations around the state. Those are the black dots here in this map. The taxidermists are the red dots, but the self-serve kiosks where hunters can leave their deer head, and we will gladly sample those. Of course, this is just from these targeted counties. We're not doing this. We're not doing this statewide, just for those counties that you see here in gray. But enough on CWD. Let's talk a little bit. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about bovine tuberculosis. I think, as most all of you know, TB is an infectious bacterial disease, primarily affecting cattle. However, other mammals, in fact, I think all mammals, including deer, and most notably here, of course, humans can be infected with bovine tuberculosis. On the map there, I should say, on the table there below, you see some numbers from the state of Michigan. That is it is in fact our closest neighbor with TB in the wild deer herd. The good news is that most of it is contained, as you'll see here in just a second, to a handful of counties. I think 95% of the positives that they collect annually are from a 4-5 county area in the northeast lower peninsula. The great news is that Ohio's deer herd remains TB-free, at least as far as we know. But you can see here's the distribution in Michigan. That handful of counties, that 4-county area there, I should say, up in the northeast corner of the lower peninsula, is where they do collect most of their samples. Historically, at least the last 5 years or so, it's been somewhere between 25 and 50 positive deer out of the number that are sampled. Now they're testing statewide, and the reason for that, of course, is that they're getting most of the deer they're looking at are for CWD sampling, but with the deer in hand, they're able to conduct CWD or TB surveillance on them as well. Again, the take home is that 95% of the positives that they're detecting each year, 95% plus, I should say, are up in that northeast corner. So we're in pretty good shape as far as proximity to Ohio goes. But I do want to mention something while we're on the subject of TB, and thankfully this is after lunch, I believe, unless the schedule gets adjusted. But I think it's important, and again, this is not something that you're going to be dealing with, I'm sure, on a regular basis, and may never deal with. But I think for those in the group that have some interest in deer hunting, may hunt in Michigan, I think it's important to point out, because this is something that I think hunters in Michigan, from what I'm understanding, they still don't get it. They open up the chest cavity of a deer, and they do not see these pea-sized nodules on the lungs, which are readily apparent, obviously, in that slide on your right there. But the folks in Michigan tell me that only 38% of the TB positive deer present with these nodules. So a little more than 1 in 3 will actually, of the positive animals, will have these pea-sized nodules on their lungs. So take-home message there is, just because your deer is not showing signs of pea-sized nodules in the body cavity, does not mean that it's not TB positive. But that said, we did have a scare a little closer to home with regard to TB a few years ago. The state of Indiana, in their southwest corner of their state, up against our border, had a wild positive deer, wild positive, believe it was an adult doe. That was the only one that they collected, even after a couple years of surveillance and hundreds of deer that they tested, which is good news for not only Indiana, but of course Ohio as well. We set up a shop in Butler and Hamilton counties, which would have been just across the border to the county where it was, I believe it was Franklin County in Indiana, where the deer was recovered. We tested roughly 200 deer in the fall of 2017, and all of those were negative, thankfully. We don't have any plans to do additional surveillance unless the cattle industry or Department of Ag gives us a reason to believe that we should be. So one of the maybe more relevant diseases, I guess, I think for purposes of this discussion today is hemorrhagic disease. We have a lot more of that in the state. We see it every single year. And while we may not document it in many counties, we do get plenty of calls. And that is hemorrhagic disease. It's the most important infectious disease for whitetail deer across their entire range. The virus is spread from deer to deer by biting flies, or sometimes referred to as no-see-ums. And I think it's important to point out that it does take this vector to move the virus from deer to deer. There is no animal-to-animal, nose-to-nose contact that's going to be moving the virus from animal to animal, unlike, I should say, fibromas. We'll talk about those. Deer warts, as they're sometimes referred to, in just a minute. And those that virus can move from deer to deer or from physical object to another deer very, very readily. So in the case of hemorrhagic disease, not the case at all. It does take a bite from a small fly to move the virus between deer. Peak time for hemorrhagic disease in Ohio, those of you may already know, but it's late summer until the first frost. And we typically see those in droughty years. This year, of course, not being the case, but of course, the entire state there is a good bit of variability across the state. So it's not like the entire state had plenty of water, but that's typically when we see most of our severe outbreaks are in drought years. And most deer are found near water sources. That tends to be the telltale sign when we're dealing with hemorrhagic disease. And the reason for that is deer typically get a high fever with hemorrhagic disease, and so they travel to water to try to cool themselves. Symptoms of hemorrhagic disease, the animals tend to get weak, they lose their appetite, certainly end up oftentimes being disoriented, which includes losing their fear of humans. And I think it's worth pausing here for just a second to point out that it's worth mentioning that these symptoms, this group of symptoms, this suite of symptoms, transcends a number of diseases and conditions that deer may find themselves subjected to here in Ohio. And I mention this because we're going to talk about, in the end, we're going to kind of wrap things up with a discussion on suspect deer, and mostly because of our interest in chronic wasting disease and making sure that we get those deer tested. But there are a number of things, and I'll mention it now and certainly come back to it. A number of things, of course, that present create a situation where deer is going to exhibit this suite of symptoms that are not CWD, and one of them, of course, is hemorrhagic disease. Another one that will cause a deer to lose its fear of humans and act disoriented, of course, is a brain abscess. So the point is, I just want to mention that not everything is CWD when a deer is acting strange. There are a number of things that can cause that. And of course, that actually creates a lot of problems for us because it means that we're testing probably a lot more deer than we need to, but better safe than sorry. Just a quick glance of what the hemorrhagic diseases look like over the last couple of years. On your left there, you see a summary from 2019. Point out for both of the maps, the confirmed counties are indicated with a heavy black line around those. We also, I suppose it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, we started trying to do a better job documenting the number of dead deer and dying deer reports that we received during the HD season or hemorrhagic disease season. The darker the color, in this case obviously red, the more dead deer calls and dying deer calls, sick deer calls that we received from that county. The lighter colors, of course, indicating just the opposite. As you can see there on the right, 2020, again, about the same number of counties where we're able to confirm it. Allen County was the was ground zero, if you will, in 2020 with regard to hemorrhagic disease. Had a lot of dead deer in Allen County, confirmed it there. Early on, we also had a couple situations where we were able to confirm it in the captive herd. I guess it was actually just one in 2020. You can see Portage County up there in the northeast corner of the state. It was actually confirmed in a captive deer and not in the wild. The crosshatch counties indicate where it was confirmed in the wild. So similar number of counties in 2020. 2021, this year has been a really, really quiet year as far as hemorrhagic disease goes. Excuse me. We've had several deer from all over the state. We've had deer from Defiance County and a number of counties in the southeast corner of the state. Actually, all 5 districts in the state have sent deer to the lab. But as of now, the only place that we've actually been able to confirm it, and this was very early September, we confirmed it in a deer from Licking County. So 2021 seems to be a rather quiet year compared to years past, but I cannot speak to the number of dead deer and dying deer calls that we've received. But as far as confirmations go, and we're closing in on the end of HD season, so I don't expect that we're going to pick up very many more counties between now and the first frost. So with the disease update out of the way, what I'd like to do now is move into some of the more common ailments, oddities, and conditions that we oftentimes see in white-tailed deer. As I mentioned, just a boatload of these every year, simply because of the onset of trail cameras. So we're seeing backyards in Marietta and Cuyahoga County and out in the hinterlands. Wherever folks have trail cameras, we're getting pictures of some of the most interesting things, to say the least, on trail camera, and those end up in our office. I want to start out with talking about fibromatosis. I think this is by far and away the most common question that we get, and I think you can understand why. Looking at this deer here in the lower right-hand corner, there would be cause for concern if you were not familiar with the fact that these warts, these fibromas, which are caused by the papilloma viruses, which are very similar, for those of you who may be interested, in the same viruses that cause warts in humans. But as you will see here in just a bit, there really are no human health concerns. They sometimes, though, can get rather grotesque and give folks cause for concern. I mentioned early on that they, unlike the hemorrhagic disease, the virus that causes that disease requires a vector in order for the virus to be spread among deer. In the case of fibromatosis, the virus can be spread indirectly by biting insects, but it also, and this is key, it also can be spread with by contact with licking branches, rubs, and other objects, and most certainly direct animal contact is possible. But over time, exposure leads to, as you would expect with most viruses, exposure leads to an immune response, and most of the time, as you'll see here, not all the time, but most of the time, these fibromas are self-resolving. And this occurred to me that they had to, although I had no idea, but it just seemed like that had to be the case, because most of the pictures that we receive are from folks in the very late summer or early summer, on into very, very early fall. But after that, we don't see photos of these. And most importantly, we were looking at between 6,000 and 7,000 deer a year at our aging stations and now at our processors, and rarely do we ever see deer show up and present at these locations with these fibromas. So most often they are self-resolving. But as noted, they can become incredibly large and grotesque, and on areas of the body where they're irritating. There's no human health concerns, which I think is very, very important. I think folks need to know that. I can't restate that too many times. Obviously, you're not going to eat a deer if you were to harvest one like this. In fact, most folks would not even dare harvest an animal like this. But if you end up with a deer that's got a couple of these fibromas on its body somewhere. They are simply attached to the skin. They do not compromise the quality of the meat. When you skin the animal, the fibromas are going to come off of the skin, and the deer is going to be fine. Sometimes, in some cases, as noted here with deer in these pictures, they become so covered up with these that they end up with secondary infections simply because they run into things. They lose vision, they're unable to eat, and these fibromas will oftentimes get caught on things, and then you end up with secondary infections. There is a rather interesting subvariety, if you will, subspecies, if you will, fibroma that I've actually started seeing a bit more of over the years. It wasn't until about a decade or so before I saw the first one of these, but these are called pedunculated or stalked fibromas, and I think you can see why. The one here that I've drawn your attention to in the upper right-hand corner, a little bit harder to see, but you can tell if you look very closely there that fibroma is actually attached to a stalk, if you will. Looks like it's sort of a mushroom standing up there. The one here on the left, in the upper left-hand corner, it almost looks as though the deer's heart is hanging out of its chest there. But from what I'm told, that is still considered a fibroma or a wart. It just so happens that it's growing on a stalk. Interestingly enough, I just got this photo a couple weeks ago from a colleague. I believe that's actually in Preble County. So moving on. The next fun thing that I'd like to talk about is the Hydrocyst, or the Seroma, as it sometimes is referred to. Get lots of calls on these. Look like they got a football underneath their brisket there. Certainly not a normal sight, but it's nothing more than a fluid-filled sac, usually found, as noted, in the brisket area. Sometimes you'll find these on their shoulders, and occasionally in the hindquarter area. Typically, these are the result of trauma to the area. In fact, that's the case most often. You know, a lot like us. You know, when we end up with a contusion, we oftentimes have swelling, bruising, of course, and that's essentially what we're looking at here. That is simply nothing more than a fluid-filled sac as a result of injury to the area. It's not a major mortality factor. Of course, I can imagine that it would probably slow you down a bit if you were trying to get out of an area quickly. But other than that, and other than being unsightly, much like the fibromas in the case of those where there's only a handful of fibromas on the deer, the venison should not be compromised at all. Simply remove the area around the hydrocyst, and I would expect that that the meat would be just fine. These seromas are relatively common across all ages and sexes. This here again, I think, is a deer from Preble County. Same person that sent me the photo of the stalked fibroma in the previous slide sent me this a couple years ago. I believe this is a button buck. So a common across all ages and sexes. Again, to sum up. Generally, other than being unsightly, typically no harm to the deer, and generally does not present a problem for the venison either. So if I had to characterize, I guess the area that we get most of our calls, it certainly would be hair loss and other coat anomalies, typically, and that's because we get these calls generally twice a year. And that happens to correspond with the molt. I think as many of you know, deer will molt their hides twice a year, their coats, I should say, twice a year, in the fall and in the spring. In the fall, of course, they're losing that red summer coat and replacing it with that with the grayish brown coat, and vice versa. Come springtime, oftentimes the deer look kind of rough, for lack of a better term, And so we'll get plenty of calls, I think, for good reason. These deer, you don't know whether they're going bald, whether they got mange, whether they got some type of dermatitis, whether it's a population level effect or just a local, just an individual deer issue that they are concerned about. But the bottom line is these are generally every one of these deer that you see here in these photos are perfectly fine. They're simply molting their coat. Nonetheless, get lots of questions, and it certainly does give us an opportunity to interact with our public. Now, talk about scientific. Moving on to something that has been on the list of unknowns for way too long. We have been able to, thankfully, our deer biologist Clint McCoy is working on a camera study on several of our wildlife areas across the state. So he's actually been able to help us solve this to some degree. But for a decade or so, we've been getting photos of deer. Again, you can tell from the photos, this deer has hardened antlers, so it's late summer, early fall. But we get these photos of deer that look literally, especially that deer on the right, that mature buck on the right, from a distance, it looks like someone has taken a Sharpie and drawn black polka dots all over that deer. Now, upon closer inspection, you can tell if you zoom in that the hair is raised in the area of those black spots. And as it turns out, as you would expect, this is some type of insect. But we still don't know what type of an insect it is. But again, sort of like the fibromas, we believe that they're most likely self-resolving because we never see these during data collection in late fall. But on to the case where we actually were able to, I think, unequivocally demonstrate that they're insects. If you look closely, the deer with the fawn, the doe with the fawn here in the middle of your screen, clearly has some black dots on some of those patches there where the hair is missing, but also here up on her cheek, you can see that there's black dots. Later that day or the next day, perhaps, those spots are in fact gone, indicating that confirming, as we expected, as we thought, that they were some type of an insect. Now, whether they're flies or keds or ticks, it remains to be seen. We simply have not been able to get our hands on any of these deer. But certainly would like to. So, if you know of anybody that harvests a deer with a bunch of black dots, a bunch of spots, which turn out to be insects naturally, let us know. We'd be happy to take a look at that. The last point I want to make is this deer that I received here on the left, the far left on your screen there, literally. Just a week or so ago, this deer, I believe, is out of Butler County, and it looks as though someone dropped a chia pet on that deer's rump. I mean, I have no other way of describing it than that, and I don't know whether that's insects as well. We have told the landowner that if he has an opportunity, is so inclined to harvest that deer, we would absolutely love to have a chunk of that hide so that we could send it off to the lab and try and figure out what's going on there. I don't know whether that's just an extreme case of some of the other situations that we're seeing. For instance, those few spots that we're seeing on that doe, or the spots that we saw on those bucks in those earlier slides. But it is intriguing, to say the least. Next, I want to talk just a little bit about the arterial worm. This is it creates it's certainly I'm sure not pleasant for the deer, but we oftentimes hear hunters describe this situation as as such that it looks like the deer has a big wad of chew in its mouth, and in fact that's precisely what it is. Food gets impacted in the jaw, and the reason is this parasite ultimately ends up in the carotid arteries of the neck, and doing so restricts blood flow to muscles in the jaw, which basically renders them useless. And so while the deer can get food into the mouth and chew to some extent, it continues naturally trying to fill its gut, and unable to do so, continues packing the jaw until it's to the point where it actually can rupture the skin. So we oftentimes refer to this as lumpy jaw. And you may see these. These are certainly much more common than the osteochondroma that you saw with the previous deer. The prognosis oftentimes is uncertain when it comes to the arterial worm. Recovery is possible, but of course, as you can see in this situation here, that poor deer continued to try and shove apples and other foods into its mouth with to no avail. It simply could not swallow, simply could not chew. And I would imagine that at some point, that a deer in this condition is ultimately going to die. Likely related to starvation as well as secondary infection associated with tooth decay and ruptured skin. So I want to wrap up this afternoon's presentation, really as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, and kind of bring us back to the primary question I think that we really should be asking ourselves is, when is a call to the Division of Wildlife warranted? We've covered a lot of ground this afternoon, lots of ailments, a lot of oddities, a lot of really unusual things. And so you may be asking yourself, well, that's all neat, that's pretty interesting stuff, but just exactly when should I call the Division of Wildlife to let them know that I've got something that concerns me? And that is certainly a very legitimate question, because I can assure you that not all of the animals that you're going to see, and I don't imagine you're going to see one of these in the wild, because as you can tell by looking at this picture, this is an elk, and this is a CWD positive elk. But the reality is that most of the deer in Ohio that will get CWD, and if they die from CWD and not hunter harvest or some other form of mortality, you're never going to see them in this condition. By the time they get to this point, they're going to find themselves a brush pile and just curl up and die. So rarely will you see a deer in this condition that's a CWD positive animal. In fact, most of them are going to look perfectly fine. Just like the deer in this photo. I will tell you that I think if I were to ask 100 people, probably 95 of them would say the deer on the left is your CWD positive animal. Well, as it turns out, that deer could very well be. It's unlikely. There are probably several other things going on with that deer, but as it turns out, the deer on the right is actually our first CWD positive wild animal in Ohio. This is in fact the buck that was killed in October of 2020. As you can tell by looking at this photo, both when the deer was alive and on the ground, the deer is incredibly healthy, just a beautiful specimen. And so, but it was positive, and it was positive. It had been positive for some time based on the lab reports. So, given that you're not going to see a deer like this on the left and a deer in the previous, or the elk in the previous photo, when exactly do you call the Division of Wildlife? When is a call warranted? And I think the guidance that I'd like to leave you with, because this is the same guidance that we share with our staff, is that we're basically looking for a couple things when it comes to suspect animals. The most important animal, the deer in this case that we want to test, is the one that is both neurologic as well as physically compromised. So if you've got a deer that's behaving abnormally, that's not showing any signs of normal signs, it's not running away when you clap, it's not running away when you approach it, it doesn't seem to be paying any attention to its surroundings, and it's also in very rough shape, emaciated, that's the deer that we want to test. That is the absolute classical CWD suspect, and most certainly one that we want to test. We call those tier 1 suspect animals. A tier 2 suspect animal is one that is displaying either neurological, is either neurologic or is in poor body condition. So not both. That is, you may have a deer that looks great but is not behaving normally. That is a tier 2 suspect, and we certainly want to hear about that animal as well. Here, just trying to prioritize things. And finally, a tier 3 suspect animal is one that you find dead. You have no evidence of injury or foul play. One that it doesn't appear that it was, if it was during hunting season, there's no harvest related injury associated with the deer. It just simply looks like it laid down and died. That's a tier 3 suspect. So when do you call the Division of Wildlife? Well, you definitely want to call the Division of Wildlife when you've got a tier 1 suspect animal. That is an animal in poor physical shape, as well as one that's not behaving normally. Tier 2 suspect, we'd also like to hear from you, but again, recognizing that we can't hear from you on every single animal, we're trying to give you some sense for how to prioritize. Tier 2 is an animal that's in extremely poor body condition, or one that's just not behaving normally. Again, like to hear from you on that. The tier 3, not to say they're not important, but of course those are the least important of the 3 types of suspect animals. That is that's a whirlwind tour, if you will, of diseases and anomalies and suspect deer here in Ohio. I know that I've covered things quickly. I don't know how questions are going to be answered, but certainly would encourage you to contact me here at the Division of Wildlife, or any of our wildlife management staff. More than happy to help you. And again, thanks to Marnie for having me, and I enjoyed being here today.